So, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I was delighted to accept the invitation to come here, but it was with a lots of ifs and buts. As you have seen, I had a baby recently, so I was happy they agreed to accept the invitation. My acceptance with all those conditions and reservations. But I'm here, and everyone is fine. So the topic of my talk is legitimacy of global energy governance. I'm going to talk very briefly about the need for an energy transition. I don't need to motivate that for this audience, I think. I'm going to talk about the current illegitimacy of global energy governance, and then discuss in more detail possible components for strengthening the legitimacy of global energy governance, and then conclude a tiny bit with reflections on the implications for the SDGs. Civilization's advances can be seen as a quest for high energy use converted into increased food harvests and greater mobilizations of materials. The starting point for this presentation is the question of how we manage the vast sources of energy that this planet harbors. And we have clearly a need for a worldwide energy transition or revolution or transformation, or whatever word you prefer, based on the facts that we have heard several presenters share with us these 2 days. Now, the question I will pose is what possible role global governance of energy could have in this transition. We have heard other speakers talk about global environment governance and global development governance, and those two arenas of governance have not really been considered illegitimate. I mean, they are certainly wanting. They're by far not as effective as we want them, but they're not so oftenly questioned in terms of and accused of being illegitimate. That we shouldn't have global governance on these two arenas. Of course, there are exceptions to this. But the story for global energy governance is entirely different. And yet it is really at the heart of the social contract that we are talking about, is the role that energy plays in supporting human well-being, etc. So, global energy governance has had very limited legitimacy in the eyes of governments, and many other stakeholders also. And here, when we talk about legitimacy, it is really a term that is at the heart of the discussion about the social contract. It's about the justified authority. What kind of authorities do we see as justified to accomplish the outputs that we want? But before I go on, I want to define what I mean with global energy governance, even though it's a term that barely no policymakers use. There are few scholars who start using it the last few years with quite different scope. And my scope is really to focus on governance that address energy as a common affair in the international community. So that means that I exclude for example, private actors, maybe oil companies that issue informal rules or show at the global level that kind of manages an energy source for their own profit. So I'm really talking about energy governance for the benefit of humanity here in some way, whether it's explicit or not. So I will spend a few slides very briefly illustrating the illegitimacy in the eyes of governments of governing energy at the global level now, particularly in the UN system, because it has been really not high on the UN agenda. Doesn't mean that it hasn't been there. Energy was addressed in a scientific conference on natural resources in 1949. There was a particular agency established for atomic energy in 1957. There's been a few ad hoc conferences. It's been talked about in some of the environment summits and sustainable development summits. There's been some committees under ECOSOC about energy and renewable energy sources. And of course, lots of the UN programs have projects that are particularly active in some aspect of energy provision in developing countries. But there is really no real home for energy in the UN system, and there's a very weak degree of formal legalization. So there are very, very weak norms on energy. As a brief example, maybe of one of actually the advances on normative text on energy was in the World Summit in Johannesburg in 2002, where they did have a text paragraph that said substantially increase the global share of renewable energy sources and regularly evaluate available data, review progress to this end. Not much progress have been on that, and it was clear in the conference in Rio last year that this goal was weakened and completely ignored because the text is just much weaker. However, they do note the launching of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative by the Secretary General, and they recognize, etc., etc. So it's extremely weak normative language on energy. And we know from earlier presentations these 2 days that there is no energy to be seen in the MDGs. But there are certainly movements now, as we heard yesterday, to include them in the SDGs. And I'm afraid my talk will maybe highlight the fact that this will be highly contentious and quite a remarkable achievement if it was indeed included. It is not so difficult to find the reason for this perspective on global energy governance of governments. Energy is really framed in the energy security paradigm, which has a national concern. It's associated with national security, and the state is the key here. It's considered as a national public good, and its provision is seen as a priority of governments. But this has also the effect that collaboration with other countries do not come easily. And there are lots of win-win opportunities for collaboration that are missed. No, I'm going to stay. Stay here. So, considering this kind of backdrop, that there is so little in terms of both institutionalized collaboration on energy at the global level and so weak norms on energy and sustainable energy, how could we then look at what are the possible ways we can argue for strengthening legitimacy of global energy governance, assuming that we think that this is important? Well, I take as a starting point a normative framework of legitimacy here. So far I've been talking about subjective legitimacy, that in the eyes of governments they are not considering this legitimate. Now I base the next few slides on a normative framework from the literature where scholars have raised possible sources of legitimacy. And these have been captured in 3 different types of sources. One is source-based, then input or process-based and substance-based. And the last 2 here is what I will focus on. They are mostly, they are the ones that are mostly highlighted in terms of legitimacy of governance. And in each of these categories, you can then find in the literature suggestions of subcomponents of particular components that would strengthen, for example, input legitimacy. You find the concepts of governmental participation, non-governmental participation, transparency, and accountability. And when it concerns output legitimacy, factors such as effectiveness and equity have been raised. So this is kind of just one way of summarizing part of the literature on this. Okay, but if we're not going to talk about strengthening the legitimacy of global environmental governance, energy governance, sorry, I've been influenced by diffusion here from all the other talks. I first want to look at the output related arguments, and then we have to think about, okay, what is the final objective we would like to achieve? We have to find some output that we want to achieve with global energy governance. One possibility that I and colleagues have formulated in one paper is a global sustainable energy system, which is a very kind of broad, comprehensive term. Or you can also take the term now adopted in the UN for a UN year and for a decade on sustainable energy for all. So these are possible objectives and output of global energy governance. So assuming that these two goals are worth pursuing, how can we then identify if governance at the global level then would be able to support the outcome of these goals? Is it necessary, or would it be help to have global energy governance? Of course, similar questions about whether it's necessary to have governance at a higher level has been asked in history, particularly in federal states, but also very much recently in the European Union. And in that context, the principle of subsidiarity has been incorporated as a way in the political process to kind of deal with this issue of allocating governance to particular levels. And in the European Union, you have two components of the subsidiarity principle. One is a substantive dimension, which links more to the process input legitimacy, and I will talk about that briefly later. Let me here just focus first on the procedural aspect of subsidiarity as it is used in the European Union. And as one observer has at least looked at it, he identifies that in the EU, this part of the subsidiarity principle means that you can put governance at the supranational level under two conditions, either when it's the most effective level to take action, or when it is necessary to achieve the objectives at hand. So what would this imply then for global energy governance? Well, what kind of governance would make it effective? And our suggestion in a paper with me and colleagues, we have suggested that it is effective when addressing, for example, global public goods dimensions of policies that are absolutely unlikely to be addressed by individual countries or the market, such as knowledge and norms promoting sustainable energy. And also when it aims to strengthen the coherence of international community support for sustainable energy. So, for example, coordinating mechanisms, institutionalized cooperation, avoiding overlaps and ad hoc efforts in the UN system when they are supporting, for example, developing countries in energy issues. Moving on to when it is necessary to have global energy governance, we would argue that it is when lower levels of governance do not have the capacity or will to take action to promote sustainable energy. And this is an exact parallel to how it is used in the EU. Or when global institutions in themselves are contributing to preserving a fossil fuel-based unsustainable energy system or unequitable energy system. I don't have time to go into examples of the latter now, but we can find them in the trade system, in intellectual property rights, or various, for example, we could look for them there at least. Okay. But now I've talked about the output-based sources for legitimacy in terms of what would make it more effective. Moving on to input legitimacy, we're coming to the different sources or subcomponents of input legitimacy. The starting point here, we can also take the parallel to how subsidiarity is used in the European Union. There, the substantive dimension of the principle is really about democracy. It says that you should not have governance at a higher, you should have it at the lowest possible level, in the sense to bring governance as close to citizens as possible. Well, if you would then somehow, because of the other dimension of subsidiarity, argue that indeed we need global energy governance to achieve what we want to achieve, then the question is, how can we bring global energy governance in some way closer to the citizens? How can we make it more legitimate in a kind of democratic sense? And here, of course, this relates to the debate on how to strengthen the democracy of global governance in general, and various proposals for this are related to the factors I have listed here on the slide. So specifically on energy, you have, for example, one of the strongest intergovernmental actors on energy in the international arena is IEA, the International Energy Agency, but it is only based with its OECD member states, so it is not universal, which limits its legitimacy significantly in a kind of universal sense. When it comes to non-governmental participation, when I have followed the few normative discussions and negotiations that there are on energy in the UN system, it is glaringly obvious that there are very few NGO advocates there. There are very few NGOs who are active advocates on energy issues at the global level. There are few on access, but there are very few on energy efficiency or renewable energy. So there's not really those actors there that could, even if we disregard all the other challenges of representation and openness, etc., of global governance processes. When it comes to transparency, of course, this is the same challenges as opening any intergovernmental governance process. You have you have an additional challenge with energy governance in the sense that, at least when you look at it at the national level, it's very clear that it has a very technical connotation, and that is also probably one of the reasons why there are so few NGOs who are active in this field, that they don't have the feel they have the technical capacity to engage in these issues. And this also makes it very hard to open up kind of the black box of energy scenarios and modeling, which are also produced on an international level. So with all the other challenges of transparency, this is an additional one. Finally, turning to accountability, there are so many aspects of accountability, and I don't have time to go into that, but I just wanted to raise one perhaps essential starting point for any remote possibility to hold actors accountable for any decisions they take on energy or lack of decisions they take, and that is some kind of reporting system. As we saw from the Johannesburg summit, I mean, there was a goal to increase renewable energy proportion in the global energy mix, and to have some kind of reporting structure for that, on how progress is moving towards that. Well, that was blatantly rejected when the issue came up in the Commission on Sustainable Development a few years later. And this was clearly the most sensitive issue, to somehow have a reporting system, whether it was for countries or for UN institutions, on how they were doing in terms of supporting this goal, or how far or close to that goal you're coming. But without reporting, you can never hold any actors accountable. I mean, and this links to the transparency factor as well. So if we look at the SDGs and considering the general sensitivity of governments to global energy governance, and particularly to reporting not only on energy issues. I mean, if you look at across all multilateral environmental agreements, in most of them, reporting systems are very weak. They're voluntary. There are very vague guidelines for what the reports should look like. So there's a very weak basis for requesting proper reports from countries. So this will certainly require a lot of ingenuity of advocates or diplomats to find a way to overcome this enormous hurdle on bringing in both energy and actually reporting on implementation of it. Okay, so now I have talked a little bit about the possibilities kind of from a normative theory perspective to strengthen global energy governance. But what matters in any effort to actually strengthen it is, of course, the subjective legitimacy, how it is seen by governments. If they continue to not want it, then nothing is going to happen. So how could you get out of this deadlock? Well, it's one possibility, or at least a possibility that I have suggested in a couple of papers, is to somehow provide alternative discourses to the national security paradigm around energy. to kind of slowly change the mindsets of governments to see energy in a broader context. And I think it seemed from what we heard yesterday from Liliana that maybe in Switzerland they actually are redefining what energy security means. So to do this in a global context, two possible, well, the first proposal that we have presented is, the first one is about looking at actually the sustainability of the global energy system as a global public good, which is quite counterintuitive for many, because energy is certainly not normally seen, it's something that we consume and is used up. But as I mentioned earlier, it's often seen as to have enough energy for a national economy. It's seen as a national public good in the sense that the government certainly invests heavily in and even goes to war over sometimes. And just as we can take a parallel in the global financial system, it has certainly been argued that the stability of the global financial system is a public good, even though it deals with money. So it's a direct parallel to this. And if you would look at this in this way, then you can see that it would reduce the risk of dangerous climate change, which is certainly a public good, and reduce the vulnerability of economic development to fluctuating fossil fuel prices. And it would make energy sources cheaper and more accessible for future generations. So these are all dimensions of the public goodness that you could look at on the energy issue. And another possible discourse is a concept that we kind of suggest, linking up to the discourse on human security. So this brings it more down to the individual level. And we suggest that this concept, if we developed a debate around it, we suggest that it's security that contributes to human security, but over space and over time. And it braces both a long-term, multi-generational, equitable perspective and a holistic approach to the energy system. So a deep energy security concept would accommodate the moral community as a global one, but still maintain the individual as the focus, which is really the core of the human security discourse. So these are just two very, I've just sketched them out here, possible discourses that you could suggest to somehow break this paradigm that seems to lock in countries into increased collaboration on energy at the global level. Okay, but I'm not seeing, the likelihood that any of these discourses will be picked up magically tomorrow. So how would we kind of get there? And first I wanted to point out that perhaps what is common with these two discourses is that they highlight the fact that there's a need for a switch in focus. From that, for a focus in the eyes of national leaders, from one where only the immediate interest of the governments and citizens steers decision-making, to one where impacts of citizens in other countries and future generations come to the fore. So without this kind of switch, without expanding the scope to beyond the national borders and to beyond the time horizon, it is hard to argue for legitimizing stronger global energy governance. We cannot do it only based on national self-interest. So then it is clear that including the it's not enough to argue that it's necessary based on national self-interest, that I just said. The perspective has to expand towards global goods and benefits and from short to long-term horizons. But this also, ties back to the presentation we heard from Carlos Lopez the first day, where he referred to Amartya Sen's mentioning of the non-contractuals, the ones who live elsewhere and the future generations. So, these two discourses would really bring those in. But such a switch in mindset and guiding value for decision-making asks a lot of leaders. Perhaps first-hand political leaders in this context, when we're talking about interstate, intergovernmental collaborations. it really, but also it also asks a lot of individuals across organizations whether they have a position of formal or leadership or not. It really requires what we could refer to as moral leaders, which, if you would define moral leadership here, implies leading with a consistent orientation of service to the common good. And what did I do?
It's older. No, it is, but okay, I don't know. I didn't. It's okay. Back
Okay.
But it's a good sign.
Yeah. Anyway, there's one more slide, so I'm almost finished. Anyway, so I can really coming back to this argument then. So I can only see this switch coming, or to how to break this deadlock is really to have leaders who are willing to kind of take this personal risk to even lose their power, to lose leadership, to move on beyond the constraints, the institutional constraints that they are finding themselves in. Otherwise, I cannot see how you would expand the discourses on energy at the global level. So, to conclude, and I will try and be brief here. If we adopted the goals of a global sustainable energy system and sustainable energy access for all, and applied the procedural dimension of the subsidiary principle, we have some strong arguments for legitimizing stronger global energy governance in several areas, if these goals are to be effectively achieved. But we can also identify the key aspects of strengthening the normative legitimacy of global energy governance through increased participation of countries and non-state stakeholders in the institutions and processes of global energy governance. At the same time, I have illustrated how unlikely any strengthening of global energy governance is because of its low legitimacy in the eyes of governments. So the only way out of this deadlock is somehow brave leaders. And then finally, the last slide, I wanted to reflect a little bit on the implications of this discussion for the SDGs. I took out some because there was more discussion on it yesterday. On the one hand, I agree with previous speakers that certainly energy has a role to have its own sustainable development goal. But the focus I've had on input legitimacy also highlights this discussion we've had about a process-oriented goal, something that links to the quality of governance and how we achieve the goals, that also very, very much matters. So with those two final reflections, which I think provide starting points, particularly the last one, for the research community very much, to kind of find ways of could we develop indicators for such process-oriented goals, how to improve the quality of governance. Thank you very much.